During the dark winter of World War II, a strange voice cut through American radios. Calm, commanding, and terrifyingly familiar. It claimed the government had collapsed, and the capital was lost. Families froze in disbelief. But if the voice wasn't American, then who was speaking to them? December 11th, 1941. America was still trying to breathe after Pearl Harbor. The fires of the Pacific had barely cooled, and the nation's trust, once unshakable, trembled under the weight of fear. Families huddled around radios each night waiting for updates, clinging to every word that promised order in a world unraveling. The radio had become more than a device. It was a lifeline. What it said, America believed. But that night, something new came across the airwaves. Something no one expected. The voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably American. It spoke with authority, the kind that made listeners straighten in their chairs. It came through familiar frequencies, ones trusted for years. And yet within minutes, that calm voice would ignite one of the most bewildering nights in American broadcasting history. The broadcast opened with what sounded like an emergency message from Washington. Static crackled, then a brief pause. The announcer spoke again, clearly, confidently. He claimed the capital was under control of a provisional military council. According to him, the White House had been secured for national safety. The president, he said, was under protection. The words were careful, chosen to sound reasonable, not revolutionary, but underneath their tone, something darker pulsed. Within seconds, radios across the eastern seaboard carried the same transmission. From Maine to Virginia, millions heard the same chilling report. Washington had fallen. People froze. Some thought they had misheard. Others called neighbors to confirm. And everywhere the same voice continued. It named known figures, real ones, from the War Department and the Navy, claiming they had stepped in to restore stability. The names were authentic, the phrasing familiar, even the sound of paper rustling, distant typewriters clacking, and phones ringing in the background gave the illusion of a working government office. It all sounded real, because it was meant to. By midnight, confusion spread faster than any truth could follow. Families argued over whether to believe it. Some said it must be part of a test or drill. Others whispered that it was a coup. For many, it was déjà vu, a cruel echo of the shock they had felt only days before in Hawaii. The chaos reached Washington itself. Telephone lines jammed. Newspaper editors rushed to confirm or deny the claims. Even a few minor officials, hearing the same broadcast, hesitated before dismissing it as false. It was too precise, too confident, too American. But the truth was thousands of miles away, in Berlin. There, inside the offices of the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, the plan had been months in the making. Joseph Goebbels, the man who once said that a lie told often enough becomes truth, had found a new battlefield. Not the skies or seas, but the human mind. And now his weapon was on full display. Goebbels had authorized a secret division known as the Concordia Station. It existed nowhere on any map, but its voice reached across the Atlantic. Through captured transmitters in occupied France, German engineers had learned to blend into the American airwaves. Their signal, powerful, precise, jumped across frequencies, slipping into gaps between legitimate channels. That night, the operation began. Goebbels' goal was not to defeat armies, but to erode confidence, to make ordinary Americans question their leaders, their news, and their very sense of reality. He believed that if a nation doubted itself long enough, its strength would collapse from within.
The timing was no accident. Only 4 days had passed since Germany had declared war on the United States. American attention was fixed on the Pacific. Fear was high, hope fragile. It was the perfect moment to plant a seed of chaos. And the seed took root. Listeners reported hearing the same voice on multiple stations. The supposed National Provisional Government issued statements about curfews, martial law, and troop movements inside the country. They sounded bureaucratic, dull, which made them believable. Even skeptics found themselves uneasy.
By dawn, fragments of the false broadcast had reached newspapers and police scanners. Clerks, officers, and families repeated parts of the story as fact. And in a handful of towns along the coast, small groups began gathering at city halls demanding clarity. What had started as a broadcast now echoed in human voices. Few realized they were participating in an experiment, one designed thousands of miles away. The Germans had struck the American heart not with bombs or bullets, but with words. And in that single night, the unthinkable had happened. The first crack appeared in America's trust of its own airwaves. As the morning papers struggled to keep up, a new kind of war had begun, one where the truth itself was under attack. The phantom broadcast, as it would later be called, had arrived, and for the first time, America faced an invisible enemy, one that spoke with an American voice. In the heart of Berlin, far from the front lines, a different kind of weapon was being forged. It was not made of steel or fire, but of sound. Inside the towering offices of the German Foreign Broadcast Service, a select group of technicians, linguists, and scriptwriters gathered under one mission: to deceive a nation across an ocean. They called the project Concordia. To the world, it didn't exist, but within the Ministry of Propaganda, it was regarded as one of the boldest psychological operations ever attempted. At its center stood Otto Koenig, a quiet, bespectacled engineer with an American past. Before the war, Koenig had studied electrical engineering at Columbia University in New York. He had lived among Americans, listened to their accents, absorbed their humor, and admired their energy. He knew the rhythm of their speech, the subtle difference between a Boston broadcaster and a Midwestern announcer. And now, years later, that knowledge had become a weapon. Koenig was no ideologue. He saw radio as a science, a bridge between minds. But in the winter of 1941, his talents were claimed by Goebbels' ministry. He was tasked with constructing a phantom, a false American radio station that could pass as real. Its mission? To shake faith in the U.S. government and sow doubt in every listener's mind. The station was carefully designed to feel familiar. The German engineers replicated every detail of American broadcasting: the faint hum of old microphones, the sound of papers shuffling before announcements, even the echo of footsteps on studio floors. Behind the voices, they added subtle background noises, typewriters, ringing telephones, and distant office chatter, all recorded from captured American equipment. To the ear, it sounded like a newsroom in Washington. The illusion had to be perfect. In propaganda, the smallest flaw could destroy the spell. The team scriptwriters were equally critical. Among them were expatriates, Americans who had remained in Europe before the war, now entangled in Goebbels' machinery. Some were opportunists, others sympathizers, but all were useful. Their command of idioms, slang, and regional phrasing made the broadcasts indistinguishable from genuine U.S. transmissions. Koenig worked late into the nights, coordinating with German intelligence officers who supplied real American news stories intercepted from wire services. Every program mixed fact with fiction, a dangerous blend that blurred the line between reality and deceit. A typical broadcast began with verified headlines: troop deployments, Roosevelt's speeches, or statements from Allied leaders. Then, seamlessly, it would slide into false reports, rumors of unrest in Washington, claims that Congress was divided, or that generals were preparing to seize power. The shift was so gradual that even trained listeners might not notice when truth became fabrication. In a cold, dimly lit recording room, Koenig perfected the voice that would carry these lies. The announcer, a skilled linguist, trained to speak flawless American English, practiced intonations for hours. He studied authentic U.S. broadcasts, imitating tone, pacing, and pauses. When he finally went live, he didn't sound like German at all. He sounded like someone America had always trusted. Behind the operation stood Goebbels himself. From his office, he reviewed daily transcripts and offered notes. He demanded precision, every phrase tested for plausibility, every false claim grounded in just enough truth to survive scrutiny. His guiding principle was simple: confusion breeds fear, and fear breeds obedience. The transmitters themselves were powerful relics. Once used by French national radio, now under German control in occupied territory. From stations near Calais and Brest, they reached across the Atlantic on shortwave bands. These frequencies were rarely crowded, making them perfect for intrusion. When timed carefully, they could slip between authentic American broadcasts, hijacking portions of the spectrum. The engineers developed what they called frequency shadowing, a method of broadcasting just below or above a legitimate U.S. channel. To the average listener, tuning a little left or right, the phantom signal seemed genuine. And because American households trusted their familiar dials, they seldom questioned it. Goebbels' team operated under a strict philosophy: never invent chaos without context. Every lie was supported by fragments of truth. The reports about martial law mentioned real cities. The supposed statements from U.S. generals included authentic names. The fabricated orders used official military phrasing borrowed from intercepted communications. Each layer reinforced the illusion until even cautious minds hesitated. And that hesitation, that moment of uncertainty, was all the operation needed. Koenig often reflected privately on his role. He wondered whether his American education had betrayed the people who once welcomed him. Yet he justified his work as scientific, an experiment in mass psychology. He told himself that the broadcasts caused no physical harm. But deep down, he knew their impact could be far greater than bombs. Back in Berlin, the propaganda ministry celebrated the early results. Reports from German intelligence units monitoring U.S. shortwave chatter confirmed confusion spreading across the Atlantic. Analysts intercepted fragments of American communications referencing unverified broadcasts. For Goebbels, this was proof of concept. His phantom had entered their reality. By December 12, additional segments were planned. New writers were brought in to script evolving stories, claims of emergency rule in 12 states, rumors of bank closures, whispers of rationing orders that never existed. Each story built upon the last, feeding a growing sense that something was unraveling in Washington. And as the night fell over Europe, the operators at Concordia prepared another transmission. The voices rehearsed, the scripts finalized, the signal hummed, ready to leap once more across the sea. Somewhere in Berlin, Otto Koenig stared at the glowing transmitters and realized the unsettling truth. They weren't merely broadcasting sound, they were reshaping reality. December 11th turned into a long, sleepless night for America. The shock of Pearl Harbor still echoed in every conversation, and nerves were raw. People wanted answers, assurance, anything that sounded like control. But what they got was confusion. By dawn, panic had already begun its quiet march across the eastern seaboard. In small towns and cities alike, rumors spread faster than the morning papers could print their denials.
The broadcast claiming Washington had fallen replayed in countless living rooms. Some had recorded fragments on home equipment, playing them again to friends who could hardly believe their ears. Each retelling made the story sound more convincing. At FBI headquarters in Washington, phones rang without pause. Callers reported hearing a government announcement that martial law had been declared. Others claimed to have caught messages suggesting a coup. Many simply asked, "Is the president safe?" The Bureau's clerks tried to calm them, but their own uncertainty bled through their voices. After all, the broadcasts had sounded official, complete with real names and authentic phrasing. In New York, police switchboards lit up. Some callers feared riots were coming. Others insisted the army had taken control of the city. In Philadelphia, banks opened early, only to face lines of citizens demanding withdrawals. The fear was subtle at first, an unease born from not knowing what to believe. But hour by hour, it spread. Not everyone was fooled. Many suspected foreign interference, recalling stories of German propaganda during the last war. Yet suspicion alone didn't restore calm. In moments of uncertainty, even a rumor can find a home in the human mind. Amid the noise, one man recognized the pattern. Vincent Malloy had studied propaganda methods before America entered the war. Years earlier, he had analyzed similar tactics used in Europe, false news bulletins disguised as official updates. When he heard fragments of the Coup broadcast, his instincts stirred.
Malloy requested access to the recordings flooding in from local stations. Within hours, he noticed something odd. The signal did not match any known domestic frequency origin. Using early direction-finding tools, technicians discovered that the transmission was bouncing from beyond the Atlantic. That realization chilled the room. It meant the voice claiming to be from Washington wasn't American at all. It was foreign, intentional. But by then, the damage was already done. Newspapers raced to counter the rumors, printing emergency statements from the White House and the War Department. Yet not every household read the morning edition. Many only trusted what came through their radios. And the voice, calm, steady, familiar, still sounded more convincing than a printed denial. The following evening, the phantom returned. The broadcast began quietly, announcing further developments in the supposed government transition. This time, it listed specific names, generals, secretaries, even governors, claiming they had pledged loyalty to the new order. They were all real Americans, serving invisible roles. The effect was devastating. Ordinary listeners heard familiar names and believed the change had truly occurred. Families argued across dinner tables. In Baltimore, a small crowd gathered near a federal building, demanding information. In Boston, citizens jammed telephone lines to local authorities. In rural Pennsylvania, one town briefly halted church services after rumors spread that Washington had ordered a national curfew. Radio was America's heartbeat, and now its pulse was irregular.
Inside FBI offices, Malloy pushed for immediate coordination with the Federal Communications Commission. If the source was European, they needed confirmation, and fast. FCC engineers began sweeping frequencies, noting each intrusion point. The patterns revealed something even more disturbing. The phantom station shifted its frequency every few hours, mimicking legitimate American broadcasters. It was a moving target. By the second night, the false reports became bolder. They described troops surrounding the Capitol, aircraft grounded across the East Coast, and civilian travel restrictions. The phrases were measured, the tone matter-of-fact. There was no dramatic flair, no obvious exaggeration, just the steady hum of official-sounding authority. In a country already shaken by war, such calm certainty carried immense power. As Friday evening arrived, even radio hosts on legitimate stations struggled to regain public trust. Some tried reading government-issued denials live on air, but their voices lacked the precision of the phantom's delivery. Listeners who had already accepted the false narrative dismissed these corrections as cover-ups. The German engineers behind Concordia had achieved something Goebbels himself described as total confusion. The truth was still there, but buried under layers of convincing fiction. Inside his Washington office, Malloy reviewed the mounting evidence. Each report told the same story. People believed what they heard. It wasn't because they were gullible, but because the broadcasts spoke their language, echoed their fears, and used their own institutions as props. This was not random deception. It was engineered trust, weaponized. As the weekend approached, 3 nights of false transmissions had shaken the nation's confidence. Federal authorities scrambled to assure citizens that the government remained intact. Still, in some corners, whispers continued. Could a coup really be so far-fetched after Pearl Harbor's chaos? Could the president truly have been replaced for safety? No bombs had fallen, no troops had moved, yet America felt under siege. For the first time in its modern history, the country realized that fear could spread without a single shot fired. The battlefield was invisible, carried on sound waves, hidden between frequencies, shaped by unseen hands. And somewhere across the ocean, inside a quiet Berlin studio, the architects of that illusion listened back to their work and prepared for the next strike.
Inside the marble corridors of the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, the sound of success was not a cheer, it was silence. A silence that followed a plan executed with precision. Goebbels didn't need applause, he needed confirmation. And by the second night of December 1941, confirmation had arrived. America had listened. America had doubted. Goebbels sat at his desk in Berlin, reviewing intercepted notes from his analysts. Reports from German monitoring posts confirmed what he wanted to see: confusion on the other side of the Atlantic. Across shortwave intercepts, fragments of American broadcasts carried tones of uncertainty, rushed denials, and strained reassurances. For Goebbels, that hesitation was victory enough. His diary entries from that month revealed a mind both cold and fascinated. The Americans, he wrote, have built a house of glass, a single stone of doubt, and it shatters. He believed the United States, with its open press and independent voices, was both powerful and vulnerable. Freedom of speech, he thought, was a gift, but also a weakness. The operation that began as a technical experiment had now become a psychological study. Goebbels wanted to understand how fear spread in a democracy. He believed Americans trusted what they could hear. If their trusted voice, the radio, could be turned against them, then chaos could bloom without a single soldier crossing their border. For months, Goebbels had studied American society. He devoured translated newspapers and listened to intercepted shortwave broadcasts from New York and Chicago. He took notes on American phrases, idioms, even their humor. He understood the nation's diversity, its mix of cultures, races, and regions, and saw it as a fertile ground for division. Their unity, he noted, was emotional, not natural. Strike the emotion, and you break the unity. And so he built Concordia around emotion, not ideology. The broadcast didn't praise Germany or demand surrender. It didn't sound foreign. It simply suggested that something inside America was cracking. That suggestion, he knew, would be far more destructive than any overt lie. Goebbels' guiding principle came from an idea he had refined for years: the big lie. Make it enormous, he believed, and people would accept it precisely because they could not imagine someone inventing something so bold. The bigger the lie, the safer it became. The first broadcast had claimed a coup in Washington.
The second elaborated, describing a temporary, provisional government formed by patriotic generals. The third added curfews in 12 states and reports of troops patrolling key cities. Every night, the story evolved, building a fictional world that mirrored reality just enough to remain believable. He instructed his writers to weave real events into their false narrative. Mentions of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's speeches, and genuine military movements created a foundation of credibility. Then, just when listeners felt safe, the lies would slip in, one sentence at a time. From Berlin, Goebbels directed adjustments after each broadcast. His monitoring stations recorded American radio responses and telegram chatter, analyzing which parts of the false story drew the most attention. If a fabricated curfew in New York sparked panic, the next night would mention Boston. If listeners fixated on the supposed provisional generals, new names were added. Always real officers, always familiar. To the untrained ear, it sounded like breaking news. To Goebbels, it was a laboratory of the human mind. He understood timing as well as tone. The broadcasts were scheduled to coincide with peak American listening hours, evenings along the East Coast when families gathered after dinner. The Germans knew when America was most vulnerable, at home, tired, hopeful, and afraid. Inside his office, Goebbels studied psychological reports prepared by his aides. They described how trauma reshaped belief, how after Pearl Harbor, Americans were predisposed to expect more disasters. People in shock, they wrote, accept warnings faster than reassurances. To Goebbels, that was a revelation. His words would not need to convince, they only needed to echo what listeners already feared. One of his aides proposed adding emotional hooks, appeals to patriotism and concern for the nation's safety. Goebbels agreed. Do not attack them, he instructed. Pretend to protect them. That twist transformed the broadcasts from foreign intrusion into apparent domestic guidance. The voice didn't sound like an enemy, it sounded like an insider. Each success emboldened him further. By mid-December, new segments claimed that state borders were closing, that the president had been moved for security, and that foreign embassies in Washington had been temporarily seized. Listeners in isolated communities without direct contact with the capital accepted these updates as fact. German intelligence confirmed widespread confusion in the United States. Analysts noted that American newspapers issued contradictory explanations, some suggesting a hoax, others refusing to mention the story at all. Goebbels smiled at the irony. Their very hesitation amplified his deception. The operation's efficiency amazed even his closest advisors. It cost Germany almost nothing, just a few engineers, writers, and a handful of transmitters. Yet its psychological reach spanned an ocean. Words, Goebbels once said, are like bullets that never run out, and now he was firing them freely. Still, he remained cautious. He knew every lie carried a lifespan. Too much detail and it would unravel. Too little and it would fade. The art lay in balance, keeping the illusion alive just long enough to plant distrust, then vanishing before exposure. For Goebbels, the phantom broadcast was not just propaganda. It was proof that truth itself could be made elastic. His ministry had created a voice without a face, a news station without an address, and a coup that existed only in sound. He once told his aides that the operation was not about belief, but about pause. If you could make a man pause, just for a second, before trusting his own government, you had already won half the battle. In the shadow of Berlin's winter, that pause had crossed the ocean. And while America struggled to understand the invisible voice, Goebbels prepared his next move, confident that doubt, once seated, would grow on its own. The lies had crossed an ocean. Now America had to answer.
By mid-December 1941, the false broadcasts had shaken public confidence. The nation wasn't collapsing, but its nerves were. Washington knew the next battle wouldn't be fought on land or sea. It would be fought in the invisible space between frequencies. In a quiet office on Pennsylvania Avenue, a new organization was taking shape. Its mission? To fight words with words. The Office of War Information, or OWI, had just been formed. A team of writers, engineers, and intelligence officers determined to counter foreign propaganda. At its head stood Robert Sherwood, a Pulitzer-winning playwright who had traded the stage for a war desk. Sherwood understood storytelling. He knew that lies could only be defeated by something more compelling, not louder, but truer. He built his team like a creative army. Journalists, linguists, and even Hollywood script editors. Together, they studied the enemy's methods, dissecting each broadcast, line by line. They didn't just ask what was being said, but why it worked. Sherwood believed that propaganda didn't need to be loud. It only needed to sound familiar. So America's counterstrike would do the same. Instead of shouting denials, they would restore trust one broadcast at a time. Meanwhile, President Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared his own response. Advisors urged him to issue a direct condemnation of the false reports, but Roosevelt refused. Mentioning the broadcasts, he said, would only give them oxygen. "We do not chase ghosts," he told Sherwood. Instead, he would remind Americans where the truth lived. In verified, trusted voices. On December 15, 1941, Roosevelt spoke to the nation through one of his famous fireside chats. The tone was calm, reassuring, deliberate. He never once referred to the fake coup. Instead, he spoke about national unity, about patience, about the strength of truth in uncertain times. In moments of crisis, he said, we find courage not in rumors, but in reason. Across the country, millions listened. The steady rhythm of his voice cut through the static of deception. For many, it was the first time in days they felt the ground beneath them again. At the same time, the FBI intensified its investigation. Vincent Malloy, the counterintelligence agent who had first recognized the Phantom's pattern, worked alongside Federal Communications Commission engineers. Together, they tracked the rogue signal across the Atlantic, confirming its European origin. But jamming it without harming legitimate stations was a challenge. Every American network was part of a fragile system. Disrupt one, and thousands could go silent. That was when engineers proposed a radical solution: selective interference. Instead of blanketing entire frequencies, they would build precision jammers, equipment tuned to specific bandwidths. It was an early form of what would later be called electronic warfare. But in 1941, it was uncharted territory. As Sherwood's office refined counter-narratives, the technical teams went to work on the front lines of the airwaves. They experimented with wave disruption, alternating static bursts, and encoded tones to drown out foreign intrusions. It was crude but effective. The Germans had built their illusion carefully, but America was learning fast. Meanwhile, Sherwood's writers crafted new radio segments designed to rebuild faith. They called them truth windows. Short, verified reports broadcast through trusted networks. Each began with a signature phrase that listeners could recognize as authentic. Later, this system evolved into a set of authentication codes, simple but revolutionary. A legitimate American broadcast would open or close with a subtle cue, often just a repeated word or phrase. Listeners learned to identify them instinctively. It was the birth of verification broadcasting, a practice that would define wartime communication. To reinforce unity, Sherwood also reached out to Hollywood.
Filmmakers began producing short reels that reminded audiences of the dangers of rumor. In one, a fictional town falls into chaos after believing a false report, only to discover it was the work of enemy voices. The message was clear: don't trust what you can't confirm. Inside the White House, Roosevelt reviewed daily intelligence briefings on the operation. Each report showed progress. Panic calls were declining. Newspapers, now coordinated with the WWII, began running educational pieces explaining how to detect fake transmissions. If it sounds official but can't be verified, one headline read, turn the dial. Even private broadcasters joined the effort. Rival networks, once fierce competitors, agreed on shared standards for verification. Their announcers began using consistent sign-ons, familiar tones, and station codes. This unity, once unthinkable in peacetime, now became a weapon of defense. Malloy's investigation also uncovered valuable insight. The German broadcasts relied heavily on accurate American data. Their success came from mixing truth and fiction. So the FBI began quietly restricting sensitive information about government operations, reducing the enemy's ability to anchor lies in reality. By late December, American countermeasures were working. Each night, as the phantom tried to return, more listeners recognized the pattern. Some even mocked it, calling the mysterious Concordia voice a ghost from Berlin. The fear that once paralyzed now began to fade, replaced by defiance. For Goebbels, it was a warning. His creation was losing grip. The more America coordinated, the harder deception became. But for the United States, this victory came with revelation. The phantom broadcast had exposed a new kind of battlefield, one where words could wound and static could shield. For the first time, American leaders realized that defending truth required as much strategy as defending territory. By Christmas 1941, the false transmissions had grown faint. They still appeared sporadically, but their power had dissolved. Roosevelt's quiet confidence, Sherwood's crafted truth, and Malloy's relentless pursuit had restored the airwaves. The war of wavelengths had begun, and America had just won its first invisible battle.
The phantom voice that drifted across the Atlantic never dropped bombs, but it left invisible wounds. Long after the signal faded, its echoes lingered in American homes, in lost trust, in sleepless nights, and in the quiet strain between neighbors who no longer agreed on what was real. Across the Pacific Coast, in San Francisco's crowded streets, Margaret Chen listened anxiously as rumors spread. She was a nurse at a local hospital, working double shifts since the war began. Born in California to Chinese parents, she had spent her life believing in the American dream, that hard work and honesty could outlast any hardship. But when the phantom broadcast claimed the government had fallen, something inside her trembled. Whispers began in the hospital cafeteria. Some claimed foreign agents were seizing cities. Others spoke of martial law spreading east to west. Margaret tried to calm her patients, but she could feel their unease. One man refused treatment, insisting he needed to return home before the new government closed the roads. For Margaret, the lies carried another sting. In the days after Pearl Harbor, many Americans struggled to tell allies from enemies in Asia. She noticed the stares grow sharper, the questions colder. When the fake reports mentioned foreign infiltration, some patients looked at her differently. She had done nothing wrong, yet the broadcasts made suspicion bloom where trust once lived. In Detroit, Andrew Novak, a factory worker and father of two, heard the phantom message during a late-night shift. The radio in his workshop buzzed with static, then delivered the chilling claim that Washington had been taken over. For hours, he couldn't focus. He had served in the Great War and thought he'd left chaos behind. Now it seemed to be returning, not from bombs, but from words.
The next morning, Andrew stayed home. He told his wife he needed to see what was happening before returning to work.
But every person he asked had heard something different. Some said the president was safe. Others claimed he'd been removed. By the end of the day, confusion turned to paralysis. He missed 2 more shifts. His factory, already stretched by wartime production, couldn't afford absences. When he returned, his position had been reassigned. For weeks, he searched for another job, haunted by guilt, not only for losing work, but for believing what he heard. The truth came too late to fix the damage. The broadcasts reached deep into America's social fabric, where trust was both the glue and the target. Jewish families in New York, already wary of growing anti-Semitism abroad, grew anxious hearing the Phantom's claims of government collapse. Some feared pro-German factions might rise within the chaos. A few even packed belongings, preparing to cross into Canada if unrest reached their streets. In small towns across Pennsylvania and Ohio, communities divided. Some insisted the broadcasts were German tricks. Others, distrustful of distant authorities, believed the rumors were being suppressed. Churches became gathering places for truth seekers, not for worship, but for reassurance. Pastors stood before anxious congregations, reading printed government statements and urging calm. Yet the mere need for reassurance revealed how fragile confidence had become. In one school outside Boston, teachers dismissed classes early after frightened parents arrived demanding their children's safety. The principal tried to explain that the news was false, but few listened. The panic felt real, and that was enough. Everywhere, small cracks formed in the national psyche. The Phantom broadcast had done more than confuse facts. It had infected relationships. Neighbors questioned neighbors. Friends argued over what they heard. Families split between believers and skeptics. For the first time, truth itself had become a matter of opinion. FBI field reports later described these days as a temporary fog, a period when emotion outpaced evidence. Even after official denial spread, traces of uncertainty lingered. Some citizens wondered if the government was merely hiding the coup's aftermath. Once faith is shaken, clarity takes time to return. In Washington, intelligence analysts began compiling testimonies from affected citizens. They discovered a pattern. The people most vulnerable to the hoax were not the uninformed, but the overexposed. Those who consumed news constantly, desperate for control. The more they listened, the more they feared. It was a paradox of modern life. Information that promised security had instead deepened anxiety.
For Margaret Chen, the weeks that followed left a lasting scar. She continued her nursing work, but trust came harder. Every rumor now felt like a shadow. Every broadcast a test. Years later, she would describe that winter as the moment I learned that even truth can sound uncertain. Andrew Novak's story ended quietly. He found work again by spring, but the damage to his confidence remained. The war's victory years later would bring pride, yet for him, it also carried a quiet grief. He had seen how quickly fear could unmake stability. These were not isolated cases. They were reminders that propaganda, though unseen, leaves real marks. It can turn calm minds restless, honest citizens doubtful, and communities wary of one another. When the WWII finally restored order to the airwaves, it also began a deeper mission, teaching Americans how to question, verify, and think critically. For the first time, media literacy became part of national defense. The government understood that protecting borders was not enough. It had to protect belief. The Phantom broadcast vanished from the dial, but not from memory. In homes across the nation, radios once trusted without question now carried a faint trace of suspicion. Every message had to earn faith again. The cost of the lie was invisible, but profound. It wasn't measured in territory lost or lives taken, but in something far more fragile, the trust between a government and its people. And though America would win the war that followed, the scars of that deception would remain. Reminders that even the strongest nations can tremble when the truth is turned into a weapon.
By the end of December 1941, the voice of Concordia had grown quieter. But it was not gone. The broadcasts no longer caused panic, yet every time they resurfaced, they reopened a wound. To end the threat, America needed to do more than counter the lies. They had to silence the source. The task fell to the Federal Communications Commission, whose engineers had become the nation's first soldiers in the War of Sound. Leading the mission was Patricia Wells, a young but brilliant radio specialist. She had joined the FCC just before the war, one of the few women in a field still dominated by men. But her grasp of signal theory was unmatched. Now, she faced a challenge unlike any before, tracking a voice that existed everywhere and nowhere at once. The search began in Washington, where Wells gathered her small team in a windowless room filled with humming receivers. Each dial glowed faintly, tuned to different shortwave bands. The team recorded every suspicious signal that carried an American accent. Most were harmless, static, chatter, or foreign relays. But a few carried the Phantom's distinct signature, calm authority, official phrasing, and subtle shifts in tone. Using direction-finding antennas placed across the East Coast, Wells began triangulating the origin. Each intercepted signal gave a line of bearing, a rough angle pointing toward the source. When combined from multiple stations, those lines intersected somewhere over the Atlantic. It was the first proof that the broadcasts weren't domestic. But that was only the beginning. The signal didn't stay still. The Germans were moving across frequencies, sometimes vanishing mid-sentence, only to reappear elsewhere. Their engineers had mastered what Wells called ghost hopping. Each shift forced her team to start calculations anew. Every night they listened through the static, marking patterns. The Phantom voice favored frequencies just below American government channels, a subtle taunt. Sometimes it would mimic a legitimate station's style so precisely that even experts hesitated before labeling it false.
Then came a breakthrough. British intelligence, monitoring European transmissions from listening posts in Bletchley and Cheltenham, shared intercepted German communications referring to Operation Concordia. The documents mentioned transmitters near Calais and Brest, both under German occupation. These were powerful shortwave installations once used by French broadcasters before the invasion. With this clue, Wells coordinated with British and Canadian radio monitoring networks. They compared readings across continents, building a transatlantic map of the ghost signal. The evidence pointed to northern France, a perfect location, close enough to reach America's east coast, yet far enough to mask origin. Still, pinpointing the exact site was difficult. The Germans operated multiple transmitters, switching between them to avoid detection. It was a cat-and-mouse game played in invisible space. The Allies responded by creating synchronized monitoring stations from Newfoundland to Scotland. Each post listened to assigned frequencies, logging times, strengths, and variations. Wells compiled these logs into a massive chart, a living diagram of the Phantom's movements. Over days, patterns emerged. The broadcasts followed a rhythm, airing during peak American hours when families gathered around radios. The Germans had studied not only technology, but behavior. As 1942 approached, the hunt intensified. Wells worked with Navy technicians to design selective jamming devices, equipment capable of sending interference precisely over the Phantom's frequency without disturbing legitimate signals. It was delicate work. One wrong setting could silence friendly stations across half a state. In early tests, the team succeeded briefly. During one Phantom transmission, a sudden wave of static drowned the voice mid-sentence. For a moment, silence claimed victory. But seconds later, the broadcast reappeared, shifted, distorted, but alive. The Germans had anticipated interference and adjusted instantly. Wells refused to yield. She realized the key wasn't brute force, it was anticipation. If her team could predict the next frequency hop, they could jam it before the signal arrived. It required studying not just wavelengths, but psychology, the patterns of the operators themselves. Night after night, they listened, charted, and guessed.
Slowly, a rhythm took shape, a pattern hidden in chaos. The phantom jumped frequencies in predictable intervals, always to bands close to familiar American ones. Wells began to anticipate the moves, aligning her jammers seconds before the voice appeared.
The results were promising. In one December broadcast, the Phantom attempted to spread new claims of unrest. Halfway through, the transmission dissolved into static. Listeners later recalled hearing only fragments: curfew, council, order, before the message vanished completely. For the first time, technology struck back. Yet the struggle was far from over. The Germans, realizing their transmissions were being targeted, began experimenting with spread spectrum techniques, subtle frequency drifts within each sentence. This early form of evasion made complete jamming nearly impossible. Still, every disrupted broadcast was a small victory. As the weeks passed, cooperation among the Allies grew stronger. British and Canadian stations shared daily updates. Navy vessels off the Atlantic coast carried portable receivers, helping confirm bearings from the sea. The combined data formed an accurate triangulation. The core transmitter stood near Calais, with secondary relays along France's northern coast. By late December, Wells presented her findings to Washington. The report confirmed the enemy's location and methods, providing the first complete picture of Concordia's network. Her discovery would shape Allied counter-propaganda efforts for years. But perhaps her greatest achievement wasn't technical, it was symbolic. In proving that lies could be traced, mapped, and fought, she restored faith in the unseen defenders of truth. For every American who once doubted the voices on their radio, there was now reassurance. Behind the static, someone was listening, not to believe, but to protect. The Phantom broadcast had begun as a ghost, but by year-end, thanks to engineers like Patricia Wells and the coordination of Allied minds, the ghost had a footprint, a location, and a limit. The war of sound was no longer one-sided. The hunters had found their signal.
For nearly 3 weeks, the Phantom had haunted the American airwaves. Calm, convincing, relentless. But even the most perfect illusion cannot survive forever. Lies, no matter how carefully built, begin to crumble under their own weight. By late December 1941, Concordia's flawless mask was showing its first cracks. It started quietly, with small inconsistencies that only sharp ears noticed. In one broadcast, the voice claimed a snowstorm had swept through Washington. But that week, the capital had clear skies and unseasonably mild weather. The details seemed minor, yet for those listening closely, it raised a question. How could a local government station get its own weather wrong? A day later, another slip emerged. The announcer referenced Jefferson Square, a landmark that didn't exist. Then came mentions of non-existent buildings and street names that belonged not to Washington, but to Berlin. Each mistake chipped away at the illusion. Listeners began writing letters to their newspapers, questioning what they had heard. Editors, now working in coordination with the Office of War Information, saw an opportunity. They began compiling lists of the Phantom's errors, publishing side-by-side comparisons, what the fake broadcast claimed versus verified reality. For the first time, the public could see the deception unfold in print. Across the Atlantic, in a dim Berlin studio, Otto Koenig grew restless. He had spent weeks perfecting the broadcasts, but fatigue was setting in. Sleepless nights and mounting pressure from Goebbels' office left him brittle. The constant demand for new lies, each more sensational than the last, was pushing the operation to its limits. Koenig's early scripts had been subtle, grounded in realism, but now, under Goebbels' orders, they veered into spectacle. Reports of state borders closing, of riots breaking out, of Canada sealing its frontier against American refugees. Each claim grew bolder, each harder to disguise. The more fantastical the story became, the faster it unraveled.
One morning, Canadian authorities publicly refuted the broadcast. "Our borders remain open," they announced. Newspapers from Toronto to Montreal mocked the German claim. The denial crossed back into the United States, strengthening American resolve. For the first time, humor replaced fear. Cartoonists drew sketches of a ghostly broadcaster tangled in his own wires. Radio hosts began using the phrase "Concordia says" as a joke, followed by outlandish fabrications. The phantom that once terrified had become an object of ridicule. Inside the FBI, Agent Vincent Malloy noted the shift. In his reports, he described a psychological turning point. Fear was no longer spreading, curiosity was. Americans wanted to know who was behind the voice. Once they began asking questions, the illusion could no longer hold. The FCC, guided by Patricia Wells's findings, released a detailed statement confirming that the rogue broadcasts originated from occupied France. For the first time, the government named the deception publicly. "The American government has not fallen," the statement declared. "These transmissions are foreign fabrications, designed to create fear. Recognize them, reject them." Major newspapers followed suit. The New York Times ran a headline that captured the moment: "Nazi radio lies exposed." The accompanying article explained in simple terms how Germany had hijacked frequencies and imitated American voices. It quoted engineers, linguists, and intelligence officials. Readers finally understood how the hoax had worked and why they had believed it. The Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, and dozens of local papers joined the campaign. Editorials urged vigilance. Not every familiar voice is a friend. By year-end, public awareness had transformed into collective defiance. Goebbels' ministry monitored the backlash with unease. Reports from German intercept stations confirmed that American radio had regained control. Instead of spreading panic, the phantom now served as a lesson, a warning about foreign deceit. In Berlin, Koenig struggled to maintain composure. His recent scripts had drawn criticism from superiors for being sloppy and unconvincing. Yet deep down, he knew the problem wasn't his craft, it was the growing skepticism of his audience. Once people began doubting, every word became suspect. Desperation led to exaggeration. One of his final broadcasts claimed that President Roosevelt had fled to Canada and that a temporary council governed the United States. The statement was so absurd that even neutral countries dismissed it instantly. Swiss newspapers printed the story under the headline, "Fantasy on the Air." Inside Germany, the operation's usefulness was being questioned. Goebbels, who once called Concordia his finest experiment, began focusing on other fronts. The resources required to maintain the illusion no longer justified its fading effect. By December's final week, Allied counter-efforts reached full strength. Radio stations across the U.S. began broadcasting short identification messages every hour, a system known as truth verification. Each message confirmed authenticity and reminded listeners, "You are hearing an American voice from an American station." The change was immediate. Listeners learned to recognize the real tone of authority. The fake one, once flawless, now rang hollow. On New Year's Eve, Concordia aired what would be its last major transmission. It spoke of unrest in New England, of soldiers guarding city streets, of rationing orders from a provisional government. But this time, no one believed it. The airwaves answered with laughter, denials, and even music. The phantom's once commanding voice was drowned out by the sound of truth reclaiming its ground. When the broadcast ended, Koenig sat in silence. The room around him was filled with the faint hum of equipment, the echo of a war fought through words. He removed his headphones and knew it was over. In Berlin, Goebbels received the final report. It was brief. Effect diminished. American awareness widespread. Recommend cessation. His only note in the margin was one word: enough. By early January 1942, the transmitters in northern France went dark. The phantom that had once gripped a continent slipped back into static. But its legacy endured. For the first time in modern history, a nation had witnessed how fragile truth could be and how powerful unity became once truth was reclaimed. The lie had run its course, and America had learned to listen more carefully than ever before. When the phantom broadcast finally went silent, it left behind more than confusion. It exposed a truth about the modern age. The greatest battles of war were no longer fought only with weapons, but with words. The deception had shown that reality itself could be bent, that trust could be made to tremble. And yet, in confronting that manipulation, America discovered something just as powerful: the strength of truth, freely spoken and fiercely defended. The Concordia incident became a mirror reflecting the deeper war unfolding beneath the surface. A war not for land or power, but for belief. Every nation used propaganda. The difference was intent. For Goebbels, it was a weapon to control thought. For America, it became a shield to inform, to unify, and to fight fear with clarity. Still, the moral question lingered. Could truth survive the pressures of total war? Some argued that freedom of speech had to bend, that strict censorship was necessary to protect national security. Others warned that surrendering transparency would make America no different from its enemies. The debate reached the highest levels of government. Within the Office of War Information, Robert Sherwood and his team wrestled with this dilemma. They knew propaganda could rally, inspire, and deceive, often at the same time. Their answer was balance. Instead of suppressing the truth, they chose to frame it, to give facts meaning without distorting them. Hollywood joined the front lines of that effort. Films and posters carried messages of hope and vigilance. Norman Rockwell painted faces of ordinary Americans, farmers, soldiers, workers, transforming patriotism into art. His images reminded viewers what they were fighting for: not conquest, but the right to think freely. Each painting, each broadcast, each speech became part of an invisible battle, one that asked not only who would win the war, but who would own the truth. In classrooms, libraries, and small-town theaters, Americans learned to question what they heard, to test every claim, to look beyond the voice. Skepticism, once seen as doubt, became a civic duty. Citizens who had once panicked at the phantom's words were now more discerning, more cautious, and more united. Ironically, Goebbels' greatest weapon had achieved the opposite of his goal. The lie that was meant to divide had taught Americans how to think critically. It built what scholars later called the armor of awareness, a mindset that would serve them for generations. Across the war, other nations tried similar tactics. Tokyo Rose spoke to Allied troops in the Pacific. Axis Sally targeted soldiers in Europe. But by then, the lessons of Concordia had taken root. Americans had learned to recognize manipulation, to see not just what was said, but why it was said. In the end, the phantom broadcast revealed a paradox at the heart of democracy. Truth can be attacked, but it cannot be destroyed as long as people are free to seek it. Lies can confuse, but they cannot endure in open air. When historians looked back, they saw not a story of panic, but of awakening. The deception that once threatened to shake America's faith instead strengthened it. It forced a reckoning with a simple, enduring truth: freedom demands vigilance. In the grand theater of World War II, the Concordia incident was a small act. A few voices, a handful of transmitters, a brief shadow across the airwaves. Yet its impact reached far beyond its moment. It reminded the world that in every war, visible or unseen, the fight for truth is the one that defines who we are. And when the last echo of the phantom faded, America stood wiser, a nation that had stared into the fog of falsehood and emerged not only victorious, but enlightened.